So in this lecture, we're going to learn how we can actually create shadows using CSS. And in order to demonstrate how shadows work in CSS, what we're going to do is to add a shadow to each of these cards here. And remember that that is one of the common uses of shadows. So to add a medium-sized shadow to a product card like these ones here, right? Now, adding shadows in CSS is actually quite simple. All we need to do is to use the box shadow property. So in order to add shadow to a box, then remember how I said that we can also add shadows to text, but a bit more about that later. But anyway, the box shadow property actually requires multiple values here. We can specify 4 or 5 values, and the first one is basically the horizontal offset of the shadow. So here in the first value, we can specify a length, which will then be the horizontal offset between the box and the shadow. So let's just try 20 pixels here. Then the second value is the same, but for the vertical direction. So basically the offset of the shadow from the box in this direction here. So let's also use 20 pixels. And for now, I'm just putting any values here. And later I will then explain how we can create small and medium and large shadows by tweaking these values. All right. Next up, the third value is the blur of the shadow. So if we use a small value, it will be almost not blurred. And if we use a very large one, then of course the blur will be huge. So again, I'm using 20 pixels here, and we will then tweak these as we go. Then value number 4 is actually optional, but what it allows us to do is to basically scale the shadow up. So let's use, let's say 10 here. All right, but remember that this one is optional, and if we don't specify it, it will simply be 0. Then the last one is the color of the shadow. And here let's just for now use black, which will look terrible, but this is just to fill it up with some values. So if we give it a save, then, well, we get a huge black and terribly looking shadow. Now, actually, we want this shadow not to be just on this part, but on the entire card. So let's see if there's a class on that, and it is. So the chair class. So here, and yeah, doesn't matter. I think all of them will have the chair class. And what I'm also noticing here is that each of them is actually a figure element. And the figure element, I think I hadn't described before, but basically it's a common element that we use for a product card like this. But we could also have used the article HTML element, such as we used in the coding challenges of the previous section. Remember that? So there we had a shoe, which was also kind of an article like these ones here. And so there we used the article element. So again, we could have used that here as well, but figure is also kind of a standard for displaying any card like these ones. But anyway, let's now go back, select the chair class here, and move our shadow there. Nice. Or maybe not so nice, because we now need to fix that first problem, which is that the shadow is very dark, which makes it look very unnatural. Now, remember from way back how we learned that when we want to display a color with some opacity, we usually use the RGBA notation for that, right? So we can easily convert that by hovering over this color. And then here in the color picker, we just need to keep clicking on this title. One more time. Yeah, so now we have RGB. And if we then change this slider, it will add the A here and the fourth value, which is for the opacity. Now, usually for a shadow, we use a very low value, something like 0.1 max. So this is the shadow that you get in that situation. However, to demonstrate all the other values, let's put it back at a high value so that we can actually see the shadow when we manipulate the rest of the values. So usually in user interface design, we want the light source to basically come from the top. So basically from here, shining down on the element basically from here. So what that means is that the shadow cannot be like it is right now, because having a shadow that goes the same amount to the bottom and right kind of means that the light source is here shining in this direction where I'm moving the mouse, right? So that's quite intuitive, I think. And so, but if we want the light source to be here at the top, so in this direction, then we do not want any offset here to this side. And so usually we do set this value here to 0. All right. And so I think that this looks a lot more natural right now. Then the other value actually looks okay. So the vertical offset. So for a medium-sized shadow, that is a reasonable amount. Then this one here, remember, is the blur. And for example, let's set it to something smaller just to see. And at the extreme, if it was 0, then the shadow would be completely a box. So just like this. All right. However, you see that the box, so this shadow is bigger than the original box itself. And so the reason for that is this value number 4, which remember is the radius, which remember is basically a value to scale the box shadow up. So usually I actually leave this at 0, and so then it will look like this. So right now the shadow is only here behind the box and then coming out a little bit here because of these 20 pixels. And if we increase those, then this part here, of course, becomes bigger, right? So I usually leave this here at 0, which is the same as leaving it out completely. But I will just leave it here so that you know for reference that there are 5 possible values. So of course, this now doesn't look at all like a shadow. So let's add back some blur here. So at 10, for example, it would look like this, which still looks quite unnatural. And well, this makes it a bit better, but still we can go bigger, like 30 pixels. And so, well, in my opinion at least, that looks a lot better. We could go even bigger, but then the shadows would start to overlap each other here. And so let's not go there. Okay, so if we now decrease this value here, it will start to look quite natural, which is always what we need to strive for when we design a shadow here in CSS. Okay, so this now looks like a nice and clean and especially natural looking shadow. And it does the job well of highlighting these cards here just a little bit, but without adding too much visual clutter to our page. And I think we can actually go a little bit lower even. So what happens if we give it 5%? Then it becomes even subtler, but it is still enough that we basically get this border here. So without the shadow, this was simply all white, which we can see by doing this, right? But as we start adding some more shadow, then of course, that starts to create a separation between the element itself and the background. So of course, that's 0.5, and maybe that's a little bit too little. Let's put it at 7. So this is basically a 7% opacity. And so this is a value that I like to use in these situations. And this looks quite nice. And hopefully with this, you learned how this box shadow property actually works. Now, this kind of property, which requires so many values, is actually a good candidate to look it up on the MDN documentation. So MDN box shadow, if you're interested in learning more about this particular property. There's also a lot of examples, for example, for creating that kind of glow that I mentioned before. So of course the shadow doesn't have to be some kind of gray, so like a variation of black, but you can use a color to create this kind of glowing effect there. And you can move the shadow around, of course. using even negative values here. And yeah, you can even actually add multiple shadows as we have on this element by adding a comma here. Right, you can also read about all of them, but we're not going to do that. But this is exactly what the documentation is for. And now just to finish, let me very quickly also show you how we can use shadows on text. So I will just copy this because it's very similar. And let's just do it here on our H1 element. So instead of being called box shadow, it's called text shadow. And this one doesn't have this fourth value of the spread. So it's just like this. Let's add some more here just to see the effect. And there we go. Now this is a lot of blur. That's why we cannot really see it. So here the values need to be a lot smaller. And now you can see it, right? So something like this might be possible. And so in this situation, of course, this doesn't look really good, but actually text shadow is quite useful for situations where you have text on top of an image. So that's something I didn't discuss when we talked about image, but that would be yet another technique of handling text on top of images. All right, but let's turn it off because that looks kind of crazy. And so, yeah, that's it for working with shadows in CSS. Hope that made sense and that it was fun to keep adding some real world effects that you see on other pages that you visit every single day. And next up, we're going to talk about border radius, which is yet another one of those a little bit more modern CSS properties that we use in the real world all the time. Moving on in our design section, our next topic is about border radius and roundness in general. Now, it might seem that border radius is a pretty insignificant detail. However, actually, it is pretty important because the amount of border radius that we give to our elements has a big effect on the seriousness or playfulness of any design. So, as I already hinted at here at the very beginning, we can use border radius to basically increase the playfulness and fun of the design by making it at the same time less serious. So here is what I just said. So the less border radius we have, the more serious or elegant a design can be perceived. On the other hand, if we add a lot of border radius to our elements, then that design will automatically look more playful and more fun. And so I think that you can agree with the fact that this design on the right side looks a lot more playful and a lot less serious than the one on the left side. Now, of course, there are also other factors that play into that perception, like the typography and the colors that are used on the left side. But nonetheless, border radius is still a very important ingredient that we can use to make any design look less serious, or on the other hand, if we simply don't use it, we can make a design look more serious or more elegant. Now, in order to actually choose the amount of border radius, a good indicator of that is the typeface. So the typeface that you choose will already have a certain roundness, and so you can kind of make the border radius match that roundness. For example, in this design right here, the typeface is pretty round, and so we have those rounded corners on the image, we have the button also completely round actually, and then we even have those icons wrapped inside of circles. And by doing that, the designer here really added a lot of roundness to the overall design, not just in the typeface, but also in these other design elements. And therefore, that takes away a lot of the elegance and makes this all a little bit more playful and more inviting at the end of the day as well. Now, on the other hand, we have this very boxy typeface, which is actually also Inter, so the one that we used in our current very small project. And so in this example, the designer added just a tiny bit of border radius to these buttons, in order to still add a little bit of playfulness to the design. Now next up, let's talk about where we can actually use border radius. And the first elements that use border radius the most, I would say, are buttons. And on buttons, we have the option of adding only a small amount of border radius, just enough to kind of take away the hard edges there. Or on the other hand, we can make the buttons completely round, like these first three here. Or we can even use some creativity and make only some of the corners round and leaving the other ones with their sharp edge. Now another great candidate are images. So it's pretty common to use border radius on images like we see here. And if we take that to the extreme, we can make them also completely round like we have it here in the center. Then around icons is also pretty common. And here again, we have those two options of only making them slightly round, so taking off the edge there, basically. And then, like I also showed you before, we can make the icons completely enclosed inside of a circle. Next, border radius is also used on some sections that we want to stand out, so a little bit like a shadow as well. And finally, also some other kind of random elements can always use some border radius. So here are just a couple of more elements that I found when researching the course that use some border radius in some form or another. And so I hope that these examples can help you to find some inspiration, along of course with all the other ones that I showed you in this lecture. And that's actually already enough for this lecture. So in the next one, we will now learn how to actually apply border radius using CSS. And specifying border radius in CSS is actually extremely easy. And so let's now go do that. So all we need to do is to specify the border radius property on some element. So let's go, for example, to images and apply a border radius to all of them. So I'm actually going to select right here all the images and then border radius. And so here, of course, we need to specify a length. And let's just experiment with different values just so you get a sense for how much border radius corresponds to a certain amount of pixels. Like if we say 2 pixels, then almost nothing is going to change. So you see that here, it is still almost completely squared. Now, if we use like 50 pixels, then that will actually take away a lot of the corner here, right? So that is 50 pixels, but now let's use something more sensitive like 12 pixels. And so this looks a little bit nicer, also because our typeface is actually quite boxy, so quite squared. And so maybe we wouldn't even need any border radius at all in this design, but of course I still want to show it to you. And so, yeah, this project is mainly about actually showing you stuff. So this images here has now 12 pixels, and this one, and this one. And so since we're already here, let's now give this entire section here a border radius as well. So we have it here on the image, 12 pixels. And so to make this look nice, we should give this section here the exact same amount of border radius. So remember, that is 12 pixels. So border radius. So if we added something else, like 20 pixels, then that would look kind of off. Well, actually with 20 it wouldn't be so bad, but let's say 30. So now it looks weird because this radius here is really a lot bigger. And so that's why we make it the same also at 12 pixels. So you see that? Now it looks quite consistent. And let's do the same here, since we're already down here as well, with these cards. So that is the chair box. Probably it's the chair, actually. So border radius of 12 pixel. And you see it down here, we have that border radius. However, now this looks kind of strange here because we have the border radius not only on the card here, but we also have it in these two corners of the image, right? So we want it here in the top, but not at the bottom. And so we can actually control individual corners also using CSS. So let's basically take away the border radius here in this corner and in this one. So let's select the chair and then the image that's inside of that. So we're using a child selector, again, selecting the chair element, which is all of this, and then in there the image, which is this element here. So remember that the image itself has a border radius of 12. And now we can selectively turn off one corner. So bottom and then left radius. And let's set it to 0. And it's gone, right? And so this is actually how you would also style a button like those creative buttons that I showed you in the last lecture. So where one corner looks like this, completely squared, and then the other three ones are round. But here that's not what we're looking for. We also want the other one to be 0. So just like this, right? So that looks nice and round. And now all we need to fix is these buttons. So this one and this one. And what we want to do with these is to actually make them completely round. So basically like this here. So where is that? Yeah, right here. So border radius. So again, here we don't want this, which of course would still not look bad. But now I want to show you how we can actually make this really rounded. Now there are two ways of doing this, but one only works if the element is a square. So if the element is a square, to make it round, we give it a border radius of 50%, like this. However, since this is not a square, it will then turn this into this like oval, and so that is not what we want. And so instead, in a situation like this, what we need to do is to simply specify a really big value here. So as long as it's taller than the element is tall, we will be fine. So we can, for example, use 100 pixels. And so now that's the result. But we could also have used like 1000 pixels, and that wouldn't change anything. It just cannot be less than the height. So like this, it wouldn't work. Like this, maybe we're already there. But to play it safe, I like to use a really big value here. So that should have fixed it here and also down there, since that is using the same class of button. All right, so this nice little design is starting to look really great, I think. Now, one thing that we still need to fix is all the spacing that we have here on the page. So there's not enough white space here, which really makes it that there is a lack of visual hierarchy also on the page. And so that's what we're going to learn about in the next two videos, so that then we can come back and fix that here in our design. Welcome to the topic of white space. Now, white space is technically invisible, but it's still actually one of the easiest and fastest ways of drastically improving your designs. So let's now go ahead and learn how to do that. So white space is basically simply space between elements, but the right amount of white space can make our designs look clean, modern, and polished, and even more important, easy for the user to understand. Just look at this design, which has very little to no white space at all. So the entire content here looks very cramped, and it doesn't look clean at all, and our eyes do not really know how to navigate this page due to the lack of all this space. However, fortunately, it is very easy to fix this simply by adding some white space to the design. So now it does look quite modern and polished, and we can feel that somehow the design has some space to breathe. So this is in fact a dramatic improvement over the first version on the left side. But why exactly is whitespace so important? Well, whitespace automatically communicates how the different pieces of information in our layout are related to one another. And so by doing this, whitespace creates invisible relationships between the elements of the layout, which automatically makes it easy for the user to navigate that layout completely intuitively. Okay, and so now that we know what whitespace is and why it's so important, let's quickly learn how to use it. So, first of all, we should use a ton of whitespace between our sections. And going back to our previous example here, we can see that the designer did indeed add a lot of whitespace between these sections. So 192 pixels is a lot of space, but it is actually not too much. I think it does look quite right like this. And the same in this other design example here, where again there is a lot of white space between the sections. In this case, it's just 140 and 160 pixels, but of course this will depend on many different aspects. You cannot just fix a number and then use that value of white space in all of your designs. Okay? Now the next place where you need to use white space is between groups of elements. So use a lot of white space there as well, but of course not as much white space as between sections. So here, for example, we have these different groups of elements, which we can clearly outline. And so between these, there is some white space, of course. And it is not little white space. So we have 96 there between the heading and then that first block of content. And then there is 152 pixels between these two rows. So it looks like it's a lot of space, but again, this is actually exactly the space that is needed to make this look clean and polished. And going now to our other example, here again, we can easily see the different pieces of content. So like these groups of elements where there are 24 pixels between all of them. So a little bit less here, but of course, once again, this will depend on many different factors. Now we usually focus more on vertical white space, but it's important to also think about horizontal white space, for example, like between these columns here. So usually vertically we need a lot more space than horizontally as a general guideline. All right. Now here I actually have another example, which is this one. And again, we can easily distinguish between the different groups of elements. And so of course, there has got to be some white space between them. And the same here in this other example. So again, two groups of elements here, and then we need to separate them visually simply by adding some white space in the form of margin, for example, in CSS. Now, next up, of course, we also need white space simply between the smaller elements. So going back here to all our three previous examples, you have some white space here, as you can see by these arrows. Then also a lot of white space visible in this example. And finally, it's also easy to see here in this final one. And once you're aware of this, you will start seeing this white space on every well-designed website that you visit. So it's something that every website that has a decent design will use a lot. Now, another guideline that I can give you is that inside of groups of elements, you should always try to use white space instead of lines. So using lines might look something like this, and this is actually a mistake that many beginner designers tend to make. So they think that in order to basically distinguish between elements, they need to add some visual lines. So just like in this example. While actually it looks way better and way more modern and more clean to simply add some space between the elements, right? So here you can still clearly see which elements belong together, but all without using these ugly looking lines. And so if you're trying to create a modern looking design, then this is always the way to go. Okay, so now you know where you should actually use white space, but how much should you use? Well, let's find out with some more guidelines here. So basically, elements that belong together should be closer together in our interface, so have less spacing between them, because that will distinguish them from other surrounding elements or groups of elements. And what I just described actually has something like an official name, which is the law of proximity. All right. Now, on the other hand, of course, if elements are not closely related to one another, then they should be further apart, so that a user intuitively perceives that a certain element or groups of elements are unrelated to another group of elements. So again, all of this is the law of proximity, and this should be the guiding principle when you define how much white space you're going to use between elements or groups of elements. So of course there are some examples here, and here we have way too little white space. So this is all packed together very closely, and the relationship between these elements is not really visible. But on the other hand, here it is much better. So the title and the text kind of belong together, and so the spacing between them is a lot less than the space that's between the icon and the title. And so this is the law of proximity in action. Now another example is this form right here, which has some ambiguous spacing. So here on the left side, these text labels are kind of in between two input fields, right? And so like this, the user has a hard time of knowing which input field actually each label belongs to. However, if we remove the white space and place the label close to the input field that it actually belongs to, we can remove that ambiguity and therefore help the user navigate this contact form. And since this is so important, let's check out another example right here. So on the left side, it doesn't really make sense why this Learn More button is so far away from that text that it is actually about. So for some reason, it's closer to those links down there at the bottom. But again, that doesn't make much sense. And so why should that button be closer to that and not be closer to the text that it's actually about? And so fixing that is very simple, like we did here on the right side. So now the Learn More button is closer to what it belongs to. And so like this, it looks more natural and makes it all easier to understand. Now, next up, there is a guideline that many beginners find helpful when designing white space, which is basically to start with too much white space and then from there remove some space until it looks right. And again, of course, by doing that, we need to have the guiding principle of the law of proximity, and we also need to be aware that too much white space looks detached, while having too little white space, of course, makes the design look cramped. So here in this example, we actually tried that, and so we added way too much space, and actually right now everything looks kind of detached. So this is not good. And so in order to fix that, let's say that we actually removed most of the white space, but then it looked way too cramped, and we can also say that it even looks uninviting to read this text in the first place. So it looks like just a wall of text, which many times users do not like to read. But then after experimenting around a little bit and adding back some of the white space, we may end up with a result like this, which looks just right. So here we can feel that the design can breathe and everything is not too detached, but also not too cramped. So like this, it's perfect. And next, another guideline that might help you choose just the right amount of white space for your design is that you should try to match all the other design choices when it comes to white space. So for example, if you have big text or big icons, for example, then you will need more white space. So just like in this first example, here the text is huge, and so we see there is actually a lot of blank space here on this page, and also between the groups of elements, there is quite some white space there. Now, if you compare this to the design on the right side, here the text and the images are all quite small, and so therefore there is also a lot less space. So it would certainly look kind of unnatural if with this small content you would add a lot of white space between them. That just wouldn't feel right. Okay? And so, again, you need to a little bit try to adjust your white space to all the other design choices that you already took. And now finally, when it comes to actually choosing the values for your white space in CSS, you can try to follow a hard rule just like we have been doing with the font sizes. Now, of course, you should not use the same rule as we used in typography, because that one is specially adapted for text. But instead, you can use a rule like this one, which only uses multiples of 16 pixels for all the margins and paddings that we apply on a page. Now, you will also need to add some smaller values like 2 and 4 and 8 and 12 pixels, but in general, from there on, all the other values are multiples of 16 pixels, and some of them are even skipped just in order to limit your choices. So it's the same idea as before with the font sizes, where I mentioned that limiting your choices is actually a good idea. So it sounds like a limitation, but it's actually great, because having to constantly think about what spacing we want to use can be really tiring. But if we have a system like this in place, then we can just choose a value, and if that one doesn't fit, then we go for the next one. And this one, believe me, will be even easier to use than the one for font sizes. So this makes designing much easier and faster, especially for beginners. And so we will use exactly this rule in our big project, and actually also in the one that we are doing in this section. However, before we go doing that, we will have another lecture in which we're going to talk about visual hierarchy. And so let's move there right now. In this lecture, we bring together many of the things that we have learned so far in this section in order to create something that we call visual hierarchy. So let's see what visual hierarchy is all about. And essentially, visual hierarchy is all about establishing which elements of a certain design are the most important ones. So that's exactly what hierarchy means, right? So essentially, we need to establish a hierarchy of elements in order to draw attention to the most important ones of these elements. And doing this is actually one of the best ways to make a layout actually look designed. So oftentimes an interface looks way more pleasing simply because the visual hierarchy is very well thought out and conveyed to the user. But before moving on, let's quickly look at an example here. Now, even without having learned anything about visual hierarchy, we can kind of intuitively see that the photos in the top and the booking box draw the most attention on this page, right? And so, again, establishing visual hierarchy is basically giving more prominence to these more important elements. And the reason why it is this way is that the visual hierarchy has been correctly established by a combination of position, colors, shadow, border, and other elements. And so that's why I also said that this lecture is basically going to be a culmination of everything that we have learned before. But anyway, moving on a little bit, visual hierarchy is also about defining a path for our users in order to guide them through the page in an intuitive and kind of automatic way. So imagine that a user enters this page. The attention will probably immediately fall on this big block of images here. Then, after that, the attention will go to this other important element, such as we had highlighted before, right? Then from there, it might go to this button because of the very bright color, and only then the attention of the user might jump here to the center part. So to the top probably of this part, and then here going down a little bit further, reading all this text, and only then in the very end, the attention might jump finally to this very small element that is here at the very bottom and with a small text. So as I had briefly mentioned already, what we do in order to establish a meaningful visual hierarchy is to use a combination of position, size, colors, spacing, borders, and shadows. And so the goal of this lecture is basically to show you how you can do exactly that. So establishing a good visual hierarchy between elements and components. Now, just as another example, imagine that we didn't have borders and shadows in this example. So then it would look like this, and all of a sudden the flow that we had before would be kind of lost. So the user maybe wouldn't really know anymore where to look after scanning the images. However, we do want our user to go to that reserve box. And so that's why this element was before featured so prominently. But anyway, we can even take it one step further by even removing the color from this component. And so now the visual hierarchy is completely lost, and the interface all of a sudden doesn't look so well designed anymore, right? So just 2 or 3 simple changes that we did here, and suddenly the design has a completely different look and feel. But of course, we want to avoid that when creating our own designs. And so let's now go learn how. So starting with the very fundamentals, the first guideline that I have for you is that you should position important elements closer to the top of the page, because that is where they get the most attention. So people usually read a page from top to bottom. And so therefore, elements that appear first on a page, so closer to the top, will naturally get more attention. Now, of course, there are many other factors involved in drawing attention, so not just the position related to the top of the page, but in general, attention flows from the top to bottom, so basically just like a river. And that applies to the overall page, but also to individual components. So in this example here, the first thing that the user might maybe notice is that logo there, then the navigation, and then immediately it will go for this main heading here. And so since this is the most important heading, it should be as close as possible to the top of the page. Then from there, attention will of course keep flowing down. And here we also see that we have this really important call to action button. And so your very first call to action button should also be as close as possible to the top of the page. Now, next up, it's important to be aware of the fact that images draw a lot of attention. And so therefore, you need to use them mindfully. So in this small component, the attention will probably immediately fall on the image and only then go here to this heading and then to the button. And so if we really wanted our user to read the text, then maybe we should consider not using the image at all or making a smaller image, because smaller images draw a little bit less attention. Then the next one here is from Instagram, where probably this first profile picture draws the most attention, and then from there it will immediately go down here to these images, and maybe then from there the attention might flow back up to these other information like followers, description, and so on and so forth. Another way to emphasize elements or groups of elements is to use whitespace strategically. So as we learned before, whitespace creates separation between elements or groups of elements, and so therefore it is also extremely important in order to correctly define a visual hierarchy. So for example, in these 2 designs, they have a lot of whitespace around this most important part of this page. So on the left especially, there is a ton of whitespace basically around this sign up form, while on the right side, there is a huge amount of whitespace between the 2 rows and also really around these 5 feature blocks. Now, I don't mean, of course, that you should always surround everything with this much whitespace. Just follow the rules that we learned previously about whitespace and you're going to be fine. The point here is just that we can use whitespace strategically in order to make important elements stand out. Okay, and now we're going to start focusing only on text elements. So learning how and when we can make different text elements more or less prominent, because this is actually one of the most important things of doing visual hierarchy on a smaller level. So for example, inside of a component. So for text elements, we can use a combination of font size, font weight, color, and whitespace to give elements different levels of importance. And by color, I mean both text color and background color, like for example on buttons. And let's study again the example from the beginning. So this one here. And so at the very beginning, we have no hierarchy at all. All the text has the same size, the same weight and color. Only a little bit of white space has already been added. Now, as a first step of improving this, we can increase the font size a little bit on the title, which is the most important piece of content here. Next up, we can increase the font weight, for example, on the location, the heading again, and also the rating of 5.0. So this is looking quite nice already. There is definitely a lot more visual hierarchy than before, but we can even make this better to make it perfect. So basically, the final step is to lighten some of the colors in order to give them a little bit less importance. So here, the superhost label, the location, and also the number of ratings has actually been lightened in order to give them less prominence than the rest of the content. And let's check out another example here, which is this one, where at the beginning all the text is at 20 pixels and there is no hierarchy at all. There's no white space, no color, no font weight, and really nothing. So in order to improve this, we can change the font sizes a little bit and add some white space. So now there are a lot of different font sizes here according to the importance of each of the elements. So already looking a lot better, but to make it perfect, we can also add some font weight and some color. So what we did here was to emphasize some of these elements by making them bold. Then we added also some color to emphasize this link. And finally, we once again made some less important text a little bit lighter. And so with this, it becomes de-emphasized, which is a technique that we use all the time to build a nice visual hierarchy like this one. So the content is the same, but compare the left with the right design. It's really all about using these techniques in order to establish a visual hierarchy. Nothing more and nothing less than that. And all of a sudden, it looks really well designed, doesn't it? And since this is so important, let's look at a couple of other examples, but this time analyzing only the flow. So here it's probably again the image who is going to draw the most attention, and only then our eyes are going to move to that headline here, and followed then by this colored button here in the bottom. So this has this eye-catching background color, and therefore it draws a lot more attention than the text that is between the headline and this button. Then we might look at the price and the other pieces of content that are here. Now, of course, these flows will be different for different people, but I'm just describing what I think makes more sense for the average user. Then another example of a well-designed visual hierarchy is this one, where again we start at the very top, but then our bright blue button here in the bottom will draw our attention. From there, we might move to this bold text here. So again, the font weight is used here in order to draw attention, right? And only then, in the end, we might go to this de-emphasized text, which is a bit lighter and also has less font weight. Then another one where we have a more classical top to bottom flow. However, that small and light subtitle that says work 03 is not really drawing any attention because it's so light and so thin and small. So that's why we skipped it, because I think that many users will actually skip that and jump straight into the headline with their attention. Now here then we have this nice and subtle background color, which makes this piece of content stand out a little bit. So otherwise maybe the attention would immediately go to that image. But like this, maybe we will first stop here, and then after that, we might look at the image and then the rest of the content here. Finally, just another one. And well, here we just start here with this really big text. Then probably we might go to this text that is a little bit smaller. And then here we have this bright color, which I think draws a lot of attention. And so I think the attention might jump there next. And only then we go to this small text, followed by this other even smaller text that's right here at the bottom. So here in this example, once again, you can really start seeing now why designers took the decisions that they did with the size, weight, color, and also white space. So all these components are really well designed, and therefore the visual hierarchy is also top-notch. And so again, nothing here is random. All the design decisions make sense because the designer wanted to establish a visual hierarchy to guide the user. But now you might ask, what elements should we actually emphasize? Well, we should emphasize contents like titles, subtitles, links, buttons, data points, and icons. And as we already saw in all the previous examples, we can also de-emphasize less important text, so things like labels or simply secondary information. So again, that example that we worked on previously, here we have the title, which is really emphasized. We have an icon, which is emphasized by the color. Then we have a really important data point, which is this rating, and that's why it is bold. Here is a link. And finally, there is some less important text here, so some additional information that on purpose we made lighter in order to de-emphasize it. All right. So these are basically the types of text that are important to think about when we create visual hierarchy. And let's take a look at a couple of more examples. So again, icon, subtitle, and link. And here we have subtitle and the title and the icon. And also the subtitle here. And I'm going through these examples a lot faster now because, as I mentioned before, I actually want you to download these lectures as PDF slides so that you can then study them on your own and get a lot of inspiration for when you start building your own designs. So you shouldn't just watch this video and call it a day. It's very important to also really analyze all of these examples one by one because I did choose them very, very carefully with tens or probably hundreds of hours of research. All right. But anyway, let's take a look at a couple more. So here again, we have a subtitle and a couple of very important data points. So in this case, that's prices. And so therefore, they are bold and bigger than the rest of the text. And I think they're even darker. Then here we also have some additional information once again. So just telling customers that this is for European cards. And therefore, this text is a lot lighter and also smaller. Then here, these icons are apparently quite important, which is why they got this nice attention-grabbing color. And then finally, there is this very subtle button, so a button with a very subtle background color, because if this was, for example, green, like the rest of the text here, then that button would get all the attention. But in this case, apparently, the designers wanted the focus to be on the prices and not on the button. And so that's why they basically took out the green background color and replaced it with this very subtle gray. Now, another one, here are some icons, some important data points, and then this label here is very nicely de-emphasized by being super small, but still with this uppercase text, which I think looks amazing actually. Then here, again on Instagram, there is a data point, and then these buttons here are actually really noticeable de-emphasized. And the reason for that is that Instagram doesn't want to take any attention away from the photos. All right. That's also why the mobile application is completely white, basically, except of course for all the pictures. All right. So that was a lot to take in about visual hierarchy for text elements, but we're not done yet, because now we need to talk about visual hierarchy between components. So that's also super important. And by components, essentially I mean groups of elements or big areas of content. So let's focus now on establishing visual hierarchy between components. And the way we do that is through a combination of background colors, shadows, and border. So let's take a look at an example. And so here in this design, this really bright background color really makes this section completely stand out from the rest of the page, right? And the same is true here on this website. So again, one big standout section, which is going to take all the attention right here. And of course, that is on purpose. So that's why they chose this color right here, because that is where they want the user's attention to go. And this second one actually not only uses background color, but also a nice shadow. You see that? Then this one here also uses shadow, and it uses border as well. So border and shadow, but no background color, while this next one uses once again exclusively background color to highlight this most important row of this table. Now, another common technique of emphasizing a component A over a component B is by simply de-emphasizing the component B. So let's say right here we have component A and B, and we want to have component A stand out more. So we could of course add maybe a border or a shadow to the left one, so to component A, but what we can also do is to simply de-emphasize component B. So it lost its background color, and now component A has been made more prominent by simply removing that background color from component B. And by the way, notice also that arrow that says free close to the Start Now button. So that is yet another way to basically emphasize that Start Now button, right? So that's not a technique I'm mentioning here in this lecture, but it's still just another way of drawing attention to that important button. So here are some more examples of de-emphasizing one component in order to emphasize the actual component that we want the user to focus on. Now, finally, just like with text elements, you now might be wondering what kinds of components you should actually draw the attention to when you're building your own designs. Well, here I have a big list of some components that we usually want to stand out from the rest of our page's content. And so let's now take a look at an example of each of them. So this is an example of a testimonial, so of someone talking about your own product, basically by trying to advertising it. Then we have call to action sections, which many times websites have like on the end of a page so that the user signs up for their product or their service. Then there are also highlight sections, as I call them, which are essentially big sections in the middle of your content, which we kind of want to stand out. And so we simply can give them, for example, a different background color like this design here does. And here are two more examples of highlight sections. And again, they use some different background color than the rest of the page to really stand out there. Then we also have preview cards, which I had mentioned before already. So basically previewing some kind of product, for example, that you're trying to sell. And so these again, many times should stand out from the rest of the content by using shadow or some kind of border. Then there are also forms, which can look like this, or pricing tables, where many times there are different pricing options, and then the designer usually highlights the one that they actually want the user to choose. So that can be done using a background color, but there are also many other options that you can choose from, as I will show you a little bit later. Because actually, we have an entire big lecture all about different components. And finally, as we already saw a bit earlier, we can also highlight or emphasize an important row or an important column in a table. And of course, this list of examples is not exhaustive. There are many components which can use some emphasizing. All right. But this lecture is already running quite long, and so let's actually implement some of these things in the next lecture. So I see you there after you hopefully finished studying this lecture some more. So let's now analyze and improve the visual hierarchy in our small design project by using whitespace and also some other techniques that we just learned about. Now this is actually just a very small project, and therefore we're not going to be able to do all of the things that we just learned over the last two lectures, but we can still analyze our visual hierarchy here a little bit, and then, as I mentioned, also try to improve it. So right now there's already, of course, some hierarchy going on. For example, if you take a look here at this component, so this header here, immediately our attention goes here to this big and bright image, and then probably here to this big heading, and then here to this button, which has this nice background color, which really makes this button here stand out and draws a lot of attention. So a lot of the work on visual hierarchy has already been done actually before, simply by applying many of the other rules. And if we move down here, it's the same. So for example here in this component here, we already made this entire component here stand out a lot by adding this background color. So by having this color, it adds a nice contrast here to the rest of the elements, so these two surrounding sections, and so that draws a lot of attention once again to this more important section here. So again, without even knowing it, we actually already worked a lot on visual hierarchy here. However, there is still a lot to do here, and mostly in the form of whitespace. So the rules that we learned about whitespace 2 lectures ago are in many situations here not really applied yet. For example, between the sections, there is not a lot of whitespace at all. So we have here this heading for this section down here, but the distance between this heading and the content of the section and the previous section, which ends here, is kind of the same. So the distance between this one here and this one is kind of the same. And so this is quite ambiguous spacing. So we don't really know where this heading here belongs to. And the same here, right? This kind of hangs in the middle of these two pieces of content. And so that's not good at all. And so remember that one of the very easy guidelines in whitespace is that we should add a lot or even a ton of whitespace between sections. All right, so let's go here to our CSS. And so somewhere here we already have some rules about this whitespace. And so that's right here. So after the header and after the section, there is a margin bottom of 48. So let's check that out here quickly, just so we all know what we're talking about. So we have a header, right? So there's some space there. And then we have the section. And so all of these then have different spacing to the bottom. All right. But now let's actually dramatically increase this. And so, just as we also learned in a lecture about whitespace, it is a good idea to use a fixed system so that we don't have to constantly choose like random spacing values, right? So we have 48 pixels right now. So all of this here is the spacing system that I mentioned before. And so let's increase that to 80 or even 96. So I'm going to experiment with those two. So let's say 80 first. Now I need to manually reload this time. And yeah, that looks better already. So here it's really visible that there now is a lot more space here. And now this heading really belongs more to this section. But I think we can actually push it even further to 96 pixels. And this is even better like this. So also there's now a nice space between this section and the footer, and here as well, and here. So that looks definitely a lot better. However, if we now scroll up, then there's a lot of space here below this image, but not here on top of the image. So we should actually add some space here as well. So basically at the top of this header. So let's see where that is. Right here. So there's a margin top of 48. And let's put that to the next value, which was, I think, 64. So 64 or maybe 80. And yeah, 64. So that looks better. Let's try 80, but I think it will be too much. Yeah. So it looks okay like this because our page is actually quite tall, but usually the browser would be a little bit smaller probably. And then this would look maybe not so nice because it wouldn't be vertically centered. So let's put it back to 64. And I think that looks okay. So that is space between sections, which remember, that's where we want to add a ton of white space. And so now let's take a look at white space between different elements. So here we already also have some white space to establish some hierarchy, because this button here kind of belongs to this block of text, I would say. And so therefore the space here is less than here. However, I think we could add some more space here below this heading to make it stand out even more. So basically, if there's more white space around it, then it will stand out more from the rest of the content. So that's 24 right now, and the next one would be 32. So that's probably good. And again, of course, when you code on your own, you'll have the system maybe somewhere else on your screen, and then you don't have to scroll up and down to see these values all the time. So that's even better now. And so let's move on to the next section. And here again, we have some ambiguous spacing. So the space between the icon and the heading, or this text here, is the same as between this heading and this text. And so that doesn't make a lot of sense, because this text here, this heading, belongs more to this text than to this element. So that's the law of proximity there. Remember that? And so what I'm going to do is to add some more space here to these icons. So here it is. It is at 16 right now, and the same for the features title. And so that's why it kind of sits here in the middle. So let's push that up to the next value, which is 24, as I know by heart. And so that is actually a lot nicer simply by adding 8 pixels of space. And moving on, here we have our next section, and here we can also add some more visual hierarchy between these 3 text elements. So actually there's already some hierarchy going on, with the most important part here bigger and bolder, and then the name of these 2 ladies, Mary and Sarah, this text is already smaller than the testimonial itself, right? However, we can also try to make it a little bit darker. And remember actually that technique that I mentioned way back when we talked about colors, where we can make the color of text inside a bright colors block like this one here, basically adapt to that background color. So what I mean is to basically give this white text here some very, very light green color. And so then the contrast between this bright green here in the background and the white will not be as big, and it will look a little bit more natural. So hopefully you still remember that trick that I mentioned before, but of course you can always go back and check that out. Now, in order to actually get that very light green color, we should go back to open colors where we got that color in the first place. So open color, I don't know if that will be enough, but it is. And anyway, if you didn't find it this way, as always, you can just go to my resources page. But anyway, let's now try out this very first here, so this TL0, which as you see here is really, really light. So the difference will be very subtle, but these small subtle effects can make all the difference if you want to create a very polished looking design. So that would be in the testimonial text, I think. Let's see. Yeah, so that's the one. So let's give it a color that we just copied. And now take a close look here at that text. And Well, it does look almost the same as before, but if you compare it with this one here, then you can notice a subtle difference. And that's going to become even more important because now we will choose another green color for this one here and a darker one. And so then that will create some contrast between these two elements and establish a nice visual hierarchy right there. So we need to select this here, testimonial author. We don't have that yet. Can actually double click here and copy that from here. And then let's get here the next color. So this one. And now let's see what happens. And yeah, so here you can actually see that this is quite green already. It's not just as white as it was before. And so this creates now, as I mentioned before, some nice contrast between this text and this one. And so the visual hierarchy is now even better established. And now finally moving on here to our card section with the best-selling chairs, there's also some stuff that we can fix here. Because once again, we have some ambiguous spacing here. So here inside these cards, we have basically three parts. We have the heading, then we have these four bullet points here. So these four pieces of information. And then down here, we have like the rest of the card, which is the price and this button. Now, right now, the space here between all of this is basically all the same. So if you take a look, then the space here between these two pieces of information and this section here in the end is exactly the same. And even here, it looks very similar. And so that doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of visual hierarchy. So we want this block, so this list here basically, to be a bit more separate from the rest of the two pieces of content. So this one and this one. And so probably we should decrease the spacing here a little bit. All right. And actually, before we do that, we should add some more padding as well, because the space here inside of this card is really quite small. So we can push it to the next level, which is 32 pixels. And so this looks a lot better with one simple change of the padding. And so now let's decrease that spacing here between these list items, as I was mentioning. So there's 24 pixels right now. So let's take that down to 16. Right? And so before they looked a little bit detached too, but now, to my eye at least, they look a little bit more related to one another. And now finally, let's also add some more space here between this list and this part down here. So let's see what we're actually looking for here. So it's the chair details and the chair price. So let's go to the chair details and change that here a lot. So here we can maybe push it even to 48 pixels. So yeah, that looks a lot better once again. But not only does it look better, but it also works better. So the design like this makes a lot more sense because the visual hierarchy is now better established. And so it's now easier for the user to figure out what they can do here in this card. Now, there's some alignment problem here that I just noticed. So this chair price here uses Flexbox, but we do not vertically align these, right? So let's quickly do that in the chair price. So that's align items, remember. Set that to center. Nice. So that's fixed now. And I think with this, we are actually done. So if we take a look at our final product, which at this point is actually finished. So we applied all the design rules to this project right now. And so I think that it is a whole lot of difference between what we had in the beginning and what we had now. And all we did was to add a couple of lines of CSS and followed a couple of design guidelines that I have been showing you throughout this section. And once more, I want to emphasize just how big of a difference all these small changes together can make. So each of these individual adjustments that we did over time here maybe might have seemed a little bit unnecessary or too much, but if we add everything together, then all these small details make all of the difference. And so we end up with a nice design that makes sense and is easy to use. So hopefully you can take that as one of the main takeaways from this section as you start creating your own designs. But anyway, this project here is now finished, but there's actually still some more things to learn in this web design section. And so let's go now to the next lecture, which is all about user experience.